Connor Matthews was a cop. He had been in Redstone Maximum Security Penitentiary for 6 days, and he knew all too well that cops weren't welcome in prisons. 6 days of keeping his head down. 6 days of observing. 6 days of cataloging every detail with the trained eye of a detective who'd spent 12 years working homicide, the way guards moved through their rounds. The subtle hierarchies among inmates, the invisible lines that divided territory, the small corruptions that festered in the shadows. But 6 days wasn't long enough to remain invisible. He sat alone in the cafeteria, working through a tray of food that barely qualified as edible, when 2 men approached his table. The first was thick-necked and heavily tattooed, with the kind of swagger that came from years of institutional living. The second was leaner, with quick, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. They sat down without invitation, flanking him on either side. Connor didn't look up, just kept eating, his movements deliberate and calm. He'd learned long ago that showing fear was worse than showing aggression. Fear invited predators. Calm created uncertainty. "Name's Vic," the thick-necked one said. "This here's Paulie. We like to welcome new arrivals, make sure they understand how things work." Connor took another bite, chewed slowly, swallowed, appreciate the hospitality. "See, that's the thing about hospitality," Paulie said, his voice carrying an edge that contradicted his smile. "It works both ways. We show respect, we expect respect back." "I'm respectful," Connor said. "That's good. That's real good." Vic leaned closer, his bulk pressing against the table. "But respect means understanding your place, and your place, new fish, is at the bottom. Which means you pay attention when people like us talk. You do favors when asked. You don't cause problems." Connor finally looked up, meeting Vic's eyes. In that moment, something passed between them, recognition. Vic saw something in Connor's face that made him pause. A hardness. A certainty. The look of a man who'd stared down worse things than prison bullies. "What were you outside?" Paulie asked suddenly, his intelligence cutting through the usual prison posturing. "You got cop eyes." The cafeteria seemed to hold its breath. Other inmates sensed the shift in tone, the sudden tension. In prison, being identified as law enforcement was a death sentence. Cops were the enemy, the oppressor. The system that put everyone here. Connor could have lied, should have lied, but he'd spent his entire career in law enforcement believing in truth, even when it was inconvenient, even when it was dangerous. "Detective," he said quietly. "Homicide." Vic's face darkened. Around them, the words spread like wildfire through dry grass whispers. Glances. The atmosphere shifted from casual tension to something far more threatening. "A cop," Vic said, his voice dripping with contempt. "We got ourselves a fucking cop." "Former cop," Connor corrected. "I'm in here same as you." "Not the same," Paulie said. "Never the same. You know how many people in here got put away by cops? How many lives ruined by badges and lies and planted evidence? I never planted evidence, never lied on a report, never took a bribe." Connor's voice remained level, but steel threaded through it. "I did my job. Clean." "Clean?" Vic laughed, a harsh bark of sound. "There's no such thing as a clean cop. You're all dirty. You're all part of the machine that grinds people down." Connor stood up, his 6'2" frame unfolding with controlled grace. He was taller than both of them, and the way he moved, precise and purposeful, spoke of training that went beyond prison yard brawls. 12 years of police academy conditioning, 12 years of restraining violent suspects, 12 years of knowing exactly how to hurt someone when necessary. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said. "I'm doing my time." When it's done, I'm leaving. Until then, I'd appreciate being left alone." "That's not how this works, cop." Vic stood as well, trying to reclaim the dominant position. "You don't get to be left alone. You don't get to just do your time in peace. You're going to pay for every arrest, every conviction, every person sitting in here because of people like you." "I put away murderers and rapists," Connor said. "If you're in here, you earned it." It was the wrong thing to say. Or maybe the right thing, depending on perspective. Vic's face flushed red, his hands clenching into fists. Paulie stood as well. And suddenly, Connor was boxed in by two men who wanted violence. But before it could escalate, a guard's voice cut through the tension. "Problem here?" The guard who approached was in his 40s, with the tired eyes of a man who'd seen too many fights and broken up too few. His name tag read Morrison. He positioned himself between Connor and the other two men, but his body language was off. He wasn't protecting Connor. He was protecting Vic and Paulie. "No problem, boss," Vic said, his tone shifting to something almost respectful. "Just having a conversation with the new guy." Morrison looked at Connor. Really looked at him. And in that moment, Connor saw recognition flicker across the guard's face. Not surprise. Not confusion. Recognition. As if he'd been expecting this. As if he'd known exactly who Connor was. "Matthews," Morrison said, "you're coming with me." "I didn't do anything." Causing a disturbance, creating tension, that's enough. Morrison's hand moved to his baton. "Let's go. Now." Connor could have argued, could have pointed out that Vic and Paulie had approached him, that he'd been minding his own business, but he'd learned in his years as a cop that sometimes the system didn't care about truth. Sometimes it cared about convenience. He went quietly, hands visible, posture non-threatening, but his mind was already working, cataloging details. Morrison had known his name without checking. Morrison had positioned himself to protect Vic and Paulie. Morrison had fabricated charges to remove Connor from the situation. They walked through the prison corridors in silence. Other inmates watched them pass, and Connor could feel the word spreading. The new guy was a cop. The new guy was being taken to isolation. The new guy was marked. Morrison led him to the administrative segregation wing, known universally as the Hole. Single-cell isolation. 23 hours a day locked in a concrete box. 1 hour of solitary exercise in a cage. No human contact. No stimulation. Just you and your thoughts and the crushing weight of absolute solitude. "Strip," Morrison ordered when they reached the cell. Connor complied, removing his orange jumpsuit and standing in his underwear, while Morrison conducted a perfunctory search. The guard's movements were mechanical, routine. He'd done this 1,000 times. "How long?" Connor asked. 7 days. Maybe longer if you don't learn your lesson." "What lesson is that?" "Don't defend myself when threatened." Morrison's eyes met his, and for a brief moment, something like sympathy flickered there. Or maybe it was warning. "The lesson is that you're not a cop anymore, Matthews. You're an inmate, and inmates who cause problems get buried where no one can hear them scream." They put him in the cell and locked the door. The sound of metal sliding into metal echoed with a finality that Connor felt in his bones. He'd put men in cells like this, had listened to them beg, threaten, cry, had walked away knowing they deserved to be there. Now he was on the other side of that door. The cell was 8 feet by 10 feet. Concrete walls, concrete floor, a steel toilet, a steel sink, a concrete slab that served as a bed with a thin mattress that smelled of mildew and despair. No windows. Just a slot in the door for food trays and a small vent in the ceiling that provided minimal ventilation. Connor sat on the bed and let himself think he'd known this might happen. Had known that being identified as law enforcement would paint a target on his back. But he'd hoped for more time, time to establish himself, time to build relationships, time to create the kind of reputation that would insulate him from casual violence. 6 days hadn't been enough. His mind drifted to the events that had brought him to this prison. The case that had destroyed his career and his freedom. The rapist who'd walked free because his father was Nathan Holloway, billionaire real estate developer with connections that reached into every level of government. The victim, Emily Rodriguez, 22 years old, who'd testified in court only to watch her attacker smirk as the charges were dismissed due to insufficient evidence. Evidence that had mysteriously disappeared from the chain of custody. Evidence that Connor himself had logged and secured. Evidence that someone with power and money had made vanish. He'd found Brandon Holloway 3 weeks after the dismissal, found him at a private club, drunk and laughing about how he'd gotten away with it, how his father had fixed everything, how there were no consequences for men like him. Connor had followed him into the parking lot, had confronted him, and when Brandon had pulled a knife, had drunkenly tried to attack him, Connor had responded with 12 years of police training and a lifetime of accumulated rage at injustice. He'd beaten Brandon Holloway to death with his bare hands. Self-defense, his lawyer had argued. But the prosecutor painted it as premeditated revenge. A cop who'd snapped, who'd decided he was judge, jury, and executioner. The jury had compromised. Voluntary manslaughter. 5 years instead of 25. His fellow officers had been divided. Half thought he was a hero. Half thought he'd betrayed everything the badge stood for. Connor didn't know which half was right. He only knew that Emily Rodriguez had come to his sentencing and whispered "thank you" as they led him away. The words "thank you" that fell from Emily Rodriguez's lips had eased his heart, as if they had justified everything he had done. The hours in isolation stretched, time lost meaning. He did push-ups, sit-ups, practiced the martial arts forms he'd learned in the academy, kept his body moving because if he stopped, if he let himself sink into the crushing weight of solitude, he might not come back. On the 3rd day, they brought him food and with it, a folded piece of paper hidden in the bread. Connor waited until the guard left before opening it. You made enemies. Vic and Paulie work for someone bigger. Watch yourself. A friend. Connor stared at the note for a long time. A friend. But he had no friends in here. He'd been inside less than a week. Unless someone had recognized him for reasons that had nothing to do with being a cop. He filed the information away and flushed the note down the toilet. On the 5th day, Morrison came to his cell during the middle of the night. The guard's face was shadowed, his expression unreadable. You're causing problems, Matthews. I'm in isolation. How am I causing problems? Your presence, your history. People know you're here now, and it's making certain arrangements difficult. Morrison leaned against the doorframe. See? Redstone runs on a delicate balance. Inmates have their hierarchies. Guards have their routines. Administration has their policies. Everyone knows their place. Everyone plays their part. And I'm disrupting that balance. You're a variable unknown. Dangerous. Morrison's voice dropped lower. There are people who want you gone, permanently. And there are people who could make that happen in ways that look like accidents. Connor stood up, moved closer to the door. Are you one of those people? Morrison didn't answer directly. I'm someone who's been here 15 years, who's seen things, who knows that the system isn't always what it appears to be from the outside. You were a cop, Matthews. You know how it works. Sometimes the good guys aren't so good. Sometimes the bad guys run the show. What are you trying to tell me? I'm telling you to be smart, to understand that survival here means more than just being tough. It means understanding the game, understanding who has power and who doesn't, understanding that sometimes the uniform doesn't mean what you think it means. Morrison turned to leave, then paused. Your isolation ends in 2 days. When you go back to general population, you will have choices to make. Choose carefully. After he left, Connor lay on his bunk and thought about what the guard had said. About balance, about arrangements, about uniforms not meaning what they should. And slowly, pieces began to fall into place. Vic and Paulie hadn't approached him randomly. They'd known who he was before they sat down. Morrison had known his name without checking. The note had warned him that Vic and Paulie worked for someone bigger. Morrison had suggested that people in positions of power wanted him gone. This wasn't just about being an ex-cop in a hostile prison. This was about something larger, something organized, a system within the system. Connor had spent 12 years as a detective, had investigated organized crime, corruption, conspiracy. He knew the patterns, knew the signs, and every instinct honed by years of police work was screaming that Redstone Maximum Security Penitentiary was hiding something far worse than normal prison violence corruption. That's what Morrison had been dancing around. Corruption that ran deep enough that a former cop asking questions could become a liability. The question was, how deep did it go? Who was involved? And more importantly, what were they protecting? Connor smiled in the darkness of his cell. For the first time since arriving at Redstone, he felt something other than resignation. He felt purpose. They thought isolating him would break him, would make him desperate to accept whatever deal they offered when he got out, would make him compliant. They were wrong. Connor Matthews had spent his entire career fighting corruption, had lost his badge, fighting corruption, had ended up in prison fighting corruption. And now, locked in this concrete box, he'd just found his next case. When they released him back into general population in 2 days, he wouldn't be looking to survive. He'd be looking to investigate, to gather evidence, to expose whatever rot had infected this place. Because that's what good cops did. When they saw injustice, they couldn't just turn their backs and walk away. Even when walking away was the safer choice, they took the hard road and fought against it. Knowing that standing up to injustice could cost them everything, Connor had already lost everything. His career, his freedom, his future. All he had left was his integrity and his training. And that, he thought, as he drifted toward sleep, might be enough. The war was coming. A war between one man and a corrupt system. Connor Matthews had fought that war before. This time, he intended to win. 7 days of isolation had given Connor Matthews plenty of time to think. When they released him back into general population, he walked out of that concrete box with a plan. Not the kind of plan that relied on brute force or desperate heroics. The kind of plan that had closed 37 homicide cases during his 12 years as a detective. Methodical, patient, built on evidence and observation. The cafeteria erupted in whispers when he entered for breakfast. Everyone knew the ex-cop had been in the hole. Everyone wondered if he'd learned his lesson, if he'd been broken. Connor collected his tray and scanned the room with the practiced eye of someone trained to read crowds. Vic and Paulie sat at a corner table, surrounded by 8 other men. Their crew. Connor catalogued faces, tattoos, body language, noted who deferred to whom, who was muscle and who was brain. He chose a table near the far wall, alone, visible but not vulnerable. Within seconds, a thin man with nervous eyes slid into the seat across from him. "Don't look at me," the man whispered, his voice barely audible. "My name's David Chen. I wrote you that note." Connor took a bite of eggs, his expression neutral. "Why?" "Because I've been watching you. Because I know what you are. And because I think you might be the only person in here who gives a damn about what's really happening." David's hands shook slightly as he picked at his food. 3 years I've been in Redstone. 3 years watching good people get crushed by a system that's supposed to protect them. What system? The arrangement. That's what they call it. Guards, administration, inmates, all working together. Drugs, contraband, protection rackets. But it's bigger than that. They're moving money. Real money. Millions. Connor's detective instincts fired like cylinders in an engine. How? I don't know all of it. I'm just an accountant who got caught embezzling $50,000. But I know numbers. I know how money flows. And I've seen things that don't add up. David risked a quick glance at Connor. You were a cop. You know how to investigate. Maybe you can figure out what I can't. Why would you help me? What's in it for you? David's jaw tightened. My cellmate was a kid named Tommy, 19 years old. First offense. He saw something he shouldn't have. Guard beating an inmate to death. Tommy told me about it. Said he was going to report it. Next day, they found him hanging in his cell. Ruled it suicide. David's voice cracked. He wasn't suicidal. He was murdered. And nobody did anything because the guards who killed him are part of the arrangement. Connor understood justice. The same thing that had put him in here was what would drive him to survive it. I'll need information, names, patterns, evidence. I can get you that, but you need to understand something. Vic and Paulie? They're not the problem. They're just enforcers for the real power. A man named Sam Russo. He's doing life for murder, but he runs this prison like it's his kingdom. Half the guards answer to him. The warden looks the other way, because Russo keeps the peace. And the other half of the guards? They're too scared to speak up, or they're dirty too. David stood, his movements casual despite the tension. There are others like me. Inmates who hate what's happening, but can't fight back alone. If you're really planning to do something, we'll help. After David left, Connor sat alone and processed the information. In 12 years of police work, he'd learned that corruption always followed the same patterns. Someone in power, someone facilitating, someone profiting. The structure was predictable. Breaking it required finding the weak link. Over the next 2 weeks, Connor built his network carefully. David introduced him to others. Marcus, a former teacher who'd killed his wife's abuser in a moment of rage. Elena, a transgender woman doing time for check fraud who saw everything because people underestimated her Jerome. An ex-military man convicted of assault who still believed in honor and duty. None of them were hardened criminals. They were people who'd made mistakes, who'd defended themselves, who'd been ground down by a system that punished weakness, and all of them had been victims of the arrangement. Extorted, beaten, threatened. Connor met with them in small groups during yard time, in the library, in the chapel. Always careful, always watching for surveillance. He taught them what he knew about gathering evidence, how to document patterns, how to notice details that others missed. David used his accounting skills to track money flows. He noticed that certain inmates received regular commissary deposits from outside accounts, traced the accounts to shell corporations, found patterns suggesting money laundering. Elena observed the guards, noticed which ones delivered contraband, which ones looked the other way during beatings, which ones reported directly to Sam Russo. She kept detailed mental records because writing anything down was too dangerous. Jerome used his military training to map the prison's routines, guard rotations, camera blind spots, times when certain areas were less monitored. He created a mental blueprint of how contraband moved through the facility. And Connor synthesized it all, took the fragments of information, and built a picture of the corruption network. It was worse than he'd imagined. Russo controlled drug distribution through a dozen inmate dealers. Guards smuggled in product during shift changes. The warden received kickbacks through a consulting company his wife owned. The money flowed in a complex circle that involved outside distributors, corrupt corrections officers, and prison officials who treated Redstone like a personal enterprise. But knowing the system existed wasn't enough. Connor needed proof. Hard evidence that would survive legal scrutiny. The kind of evidence that had convicted murderers during his career as a detective. The opportunity came during a routine shakedown. Morrison, the guard who'd put Connor in isolation, was conducting cell searches. Connor watched from the yard as Morrison and two other guards systematically went through cells in D Block. But their search pattern was off. They lingered too long in some cells, skipped others entirely, and when they left, certain inmates looked relieved, while others looked nervous. Connor understood. They weren't searching for contraband. They were selectively confiscating evidence while protecting their dealers. That night, Connor approached Morrison during a quiet moment in the corridor. The guard's hand moved instinctively toward his baton. "Relax," Connor said. "I'm not here to start trouble. I'm here to make an observation." "I don't care about your observations, Matthews." "You should, because I know what you're doing. I know about the arrangement. I know about Russo. And I know you're in deeper than you want to be." Morrison's face went pale. "You don't know anything." "I know you warned me my first week. Told me to be smart. That wasn't a threat. That was advice from someone who wishes he could get out, but can't." Connor kept his voice low, conversational. "How did it start? Small favor? Looking the other way once? Then it got bigger. Harder to refuse. Now you're in so deep that getting out means losing everything." "Shut up. I'm not your enemy, Morrison. I'm your way out." Connor leaned closer. "I was a cop for 12 years. I know how to build cases. I know how to gather evidence. And I know how to protect witnesses who cooperate. Help me, and when this goes down, you can walk away clean." Morrison's eyes darted around the corridor. Desperate. Conflicted. "They'll kill me. Russo has people everywhere, inside and outside. Not if the entire system comes down at once. Not if federal authorities raid this place before Russo knows what's happening." Connor pulled a small piece of paper from his pocket, a sketch David had drawn of money flow patterns. "Look at this. Tell me if it's accurate. That's all I'm asking." Morrison looked at the paper. His hands trembled slightly. Finally, he nodded. "It's accurate, but you're missing something. The warden isn't just taking kickbacks. He's facilitating. There's a room in the administrative wing. Files, records, evidence of everything. He keeps it as insurance in case Russo tries to cut him out." "Can you get me access?" "Are you insane? That would be—" Morrison stopped himself, took a breath. "There's a maintenance rotation next week. The admin wing will be under repair. If someone was on that work detail, they might have 30 minutes unsupervised in the right area. Get me on that detail." Morrison stared at him for a long moment, then nodded once and walked away. 3 days later, Connor found himself in the administrative wing with a mop and bucket. Wearing the blue coveralls of maintenance workers, 2 other inmates worked nearby, both part of his group. Marcus the teacher and Jerome the ex-military man. They'd volunteered for this detail weeks ago, establishing themselves as reliable workers who could be left unsupervised. The maintenance supervisor, a heavy-set man named Rodriguez, gestured vaguely at the hallway. "Clean this section. I'll be back in 40 minutes. Don't touch anything that's not related to cleaning." As soon as Rodriguez left, Connor moved. Morrison had given him specific directions. Third door on the left. Records room. The door would be unlocked for exactly 30 minutes. It was. Inside, Connor found filing cabinets, computers, and a safe that was currently open, probably because the warden had been working here recently. Connor worked quickly. His detective training guiding him, he photographed documents with a contraband cell phone that David had acquired. Financial records, shipment logs, communication records between the warden and outside distributors. But the most damning evidence was a ledger. Handwritten entries documenting every transaction for the past 3 years. Names, amounts, dates, a complete record of the corruption network. Connor photographed every page, sent the images to an encrypted email account he'd set up through the contraband phone, an account that forwarded everything to a federal prosecutor he'd worked with during his time as a detective. A woman named Sarah Morgan, who'd always respected his integrity. 30 minutes. That's all he had. He used 28 of them. When they returned to general population, Connor knew the clock was ticking. The evidence was out. Federal authorities would need time to verify it, to build their case, to coordinate a raid. Maybe a week, maybe 2. He needed to survive that long. Russo made his move 3 days later. Connor was in the yard when 6 men surrounded him. Not Vic and Paulie this time. Harder men, lifers with nothing to lose. They moved with the coordinated precision of a trained unit. "Russo wants to talk," the leader said. His name was Kruger, and his reputation was built on violence that bordered on artistic. Connor could have fought, could have tried to break through, but that would accomplish nothing except getting him killed or sent back to isolation. Instead, he went quietly, flanked by men who would kill him without hesitation. If he resisted, they brought him to the weight room during off hours. Russo sat on a bench press, a mountain of a man with cold eyes and the kind of presence that commanded attention without requiring volume. Guards stood by the doors, not to protect inmates from Russo, to protect Russo from interruption. "Connor Matthews," Russo said, his voice surprisingly soft. "The hero cop who killed a rapist. I respect that. Takes balls to throw away your career for principle. I'm not interested in your respect. No, you're interested in destroying what I've built here." Russo stood, his 6'5" frame towering over Connor. "See, I've been hearing things. Whispers, questions, unusual activity. And it all traces back to you and your little group of righteous crusaders." Connor said nothing. "I admire the dedication." Russo continued. "I really do. But you're making a fundamental mistake. You think you're still a cop. You think you can investigate and arrest and bring justice. But you're not a cop anymore. You're an inmate. And in here, I'm the law. The law says murder is murder. Corruption is corruption. Your system is built on suffering. My system keeps order, keeps the peace. Before me, Redstone was chaos, riots, deaths. Now it's controlled, stable. Yes, some people get hurt, but most survive. That's the best you can hope for in a place like this. That's not good enough." Russo smiled. "I know. That's why you're dangerous. That's why I'm going to give you a choice. Stop. Right now. Disband your little investigation. Go back to being a nobody doing his time, or I'll kill everyone you've recruited. David, Marcus, Elena, Jerome, all of them. Slowly, painfully. While you watch." Connor felt an icy coldness in his chest. Could Russo know the whole plan? Was it worth taking this risk? "You kill them. You confirm everything. You make it obvious. I'll make it look like accidents, suicides, gang violence. I've done it before. Russo leaned closer. You've got 24 hours to decide. After that, people start dying. They released Connor back into the yard. His group found him immediately, saw the tension in his face. He knows, Connor said simply. What do we do? David asked, fear evident in his voice. Connor thought about Sarah Morgan, about the evidence he'd sent, about federal prosecutors building cases. We survive. 24 hours, maybe 48. The cavalry is coming. We just need to last until they arrive. And if they don't arrive in time? Connor met their eyes, saw the fear, the hope, the desperate need to believe that justice still meant something. Then we fight, not because we'll win, but because some things are worth fighting for, even when you know you'll lose. The next day was the longest of Connor's life, every moment stretched, every shadow threatened. Russo's men circulated through the prison, their presence a constant reminder of the deadline. Connor and his group stayed together, moved in clusters, avoided isolated areas, but they couldn't avoid sleep, couldn't avoid the vulnerability of nighttime when guards controlled access and cameras had blind spots. Connor lay awake in his cell, listening to every sound. Footsteps in the corridor, doors opening, the subtle whisper of violence being prepared. At 3 a.m., Morrison appeared outside his cell. The guard's face was ashen. They're coming. Tonight. Russo gave the order. I can't stop it. Then don't. Connor stood up. Just make sure you're nowhere near this wing when it happens. You've done enough. Morrison hesitated, then nodded, and disappeared. Connor waited, counted the minutes, heard the sounds of cell doors being unlocked, heard footsteps approaching. Multiple men, armed with improvised weapons. The door to his cell opened. 6 men entered. Connor didn't wait for them to speak. He attacked. 12 years of police training. 12 years of hand-to-hand combat. 12 years of knowing exactly where to strike, to disable an opponent. He moved through them like a storm, targeting knees and throats and eyes, not trying to win, just trying to survive long enough. He took down 2 before they overwhelmed him. Fists and feet rained down. A shank sliced across his ribs. Another caught his shoulder. Pain exploded through his body, but he kept fighting, kept moving, because stopping meant death. And then, impossibly, sirens. Not prison alarm, sirens. Police sirens. The attack stopped. Russo's men looked at each other, confused. Voices shouted in the corridors. Not guards, federal agents. FBI! Nobody move! The raid happened with military precision. Federal agents flooded Redstone maximum security. They arrested guards, arrested administrators, arrested Sam Russo and every member of his organization. Sarah Morgan found Connor bleeding on the floor of his cell. Her face swam in and out of focus as paramedics worked on his wounds. "You did it," she said. "Your evidence was perfect. We got warrants, got authorization, got everyone." Connor tried to speak, but pain stole his voice. "Rest," Sarah said. "When you heal, we're going to talk about your sentence, about the circumstances that put you here, about a man who killed a rapist after the system failed. I think there are grounds for clemency. I think there are people who will fight for you." Connor closed his eyes, heard the sounds of justice finally arriving, heard the corrupt being led away in chains, heard the victims being freed from their tormentors. It wasn't perfect justice, nothing ever was, but it was something. It was enough. When he woke in the prison hospital 3 days later, David sat beside his bed. "They're transferring us," David said. "Everyone who helped, new facility, clean administration. Russo's network is gone, destroyed. Good. You saved us. You saved everyone. Connor shook his head. We saved each other. That's how it works. That's how justice works. Not one hero, a community refusing to accept injustice. 6 months later, Connor Matthews walked out of federal prison, a free man. Sarah Morgan had made good on her promise. Clemency based on extenuating circumstances. Time served. Recognition that sometimes the law and justice aren't the same thing. He stood outside the gates, breathing free air for the first time in 18 months. A car pulled up. Emily Rodriguez stepped out. The woman whose rape had started everything, the woman whose justice had cost him his career and his freedom. Thank you, she said. Not for the first time. But this time, Connor heard it differently. Thank you for fighting, he replied, for testifying, for refusing to let them make you disappear. They stood in silence for a moment, two people bound by tragedy and justice, and the complicated space between them. Connor Matthews had been a cop, had been an inmate, had been a victim of injustice. Now he was something more important. It was proof that true justice was worth fighting for, no matter the cost.